Big Shaq was casually leaning against his Rolls-Royce, scrolling through his phone, when a loud crack shattered the moment. A police baton had just smashed his side mirror. The cafe went silent. Customers froze. Cameras started rolling. Officer Daniels smirked, gripping his baton tighter. "You don't belong in a car like this." Shaq exhaled slowly, his eyes locking onto the damage. But instead of getting angry, he smiled, because he had a plan. What happened next would shock the world, ruin a corrupt cop's career, and prove that power doesn't always come from a badge. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the city as Big Shaq leaned against his custom, matte black Rolls-Royce, casually scrolling through his phone. The sleek luxury car gleamed under the light, drawing admiring glances from passers-by outside the upscale cafe. A few people took photos, others whispered, clearly impressed, but not everyone was pleased. Across the street, Officer Daniels sat in his patrol car, his jaw tightening as he watched the scene unfold. He was a man who prided himself on control over the streets, over people who didn't belong in certain places. And to him, Shaq, standing tall, confident, and relaxed in front of a car, worth more than his yearly salary, was the very definition of a man who didn't belong. Daniels narrowed his eyes. "Who does he think he is?" he muttered, gripping the wheel. The sight of Shaq laughing at something on his phone only fueled his frustration. The officer convinced himself he was doing the right thing. People like Shaq, rich, powerful, untouchable, needed to be put in their place. Without hesitation, Daniels threw his car door open and stormed toward the Rolls-Royce. A couple sitting at an outdoor cafe table noticed him approaching and exchanged nervous glances. One of them, a man in a suit, murmured, "Something's about to go down." Daniels didn't stop to ask questions. He didn't issue a warning. He didn't even think twice. He simply reached for his baton, raised it high above his head, and swung. Crack! The sound of shattering glass split through the air as Shaq's side mirror exploded into tiny fragments, scattering across the pavement. Gasps erupted from the cafe. A woman covered her mouth in shock. A man pulled out his phone and started recording. Shaq, still mid-scroll, paused. The street noise, the idle chatter, the distant honks of traffic, all of it seemed to fade as he turned his head toward the damage. His expression remained unreadable, his body still a stone, but his eyes, they locked onto Daniels with an intensity that made the officer hesitate for just a fraction of a second. Daniels, regaining his composure, smirked. "Shouldn't park a car like this around here," he said, voice dripping with condescension. Shaq exhaled slowly, slipping his phone into his pocket. The way he moved, deliberate, calm, sent an unspoken message. This wasn't over. The tension in the air thickened as the onlookers leaned forward, waiting to see what would happen next. Shaq's gaze moved slowly from the shattered side mirror to Officer Daniels, his expression unreadable. The air around them felt heavier now, as if the entire street had paused to witness what would happen next. A hush fell over the cafe as customers leaned in, phones held high, cameras rolling. Shaq took a step forward, his towering presence casting a shadow over the officer. His voice was calm, steady. "That your way of saying hello?" Daniels, despite the slight hitch in his breath, forced a smirk. He placed one hand on his belt, puffing out his chest as if trying to make himself seem larger. "This car was parked illegally," he stated, though his eyes flickered with uncertainty. Shaq raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a half-smile. "Oh yeah? Show me the sign." For a brief moment, Daniels hesitated. There was no sign, no parking violation, no reason, at least not one he could say out loud. But backing down now, not an option. Daniels squared his shoulders. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he said, voice sharp. "Step away from the vehicle." Shaq exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "Nah, see? That's not how this works. You broke my car, and now you're telling me to step away?" The crowd was growing, whispers spreading. "Is that Shaq?" someone murmured. Another person whispered, "This cop's about to get himself in trouble." Daniels could feel the weight of eyes on him, the pressure mounting, but he refused to back down. His hand twitched near his holster, not drawing his weapon, but letting the movement be seen. "I suggest you walk away, son," Daniels said, emphasizing the last word in a way that made a few bystanders murmur in disapproval. Shaq's smirk disappeared. He folded his massive arms across his chest. Standy, nung his ground. His voice dropped lower, steadier. Yeah, that ain't happening. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Phones were still recording. The cafe's staff peeked through the windows. The people watching didn't just see a broken mirror anymore. They saw a confrontation that could turn into something much bigger. And then, in the distance, the faint sound of sirens. Daniel's smirk widened. He had called for backup. Shaq? He didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just watched, waiting. Daniels pressed the button on his radio, his voice dripping with manufactured urgency. Officer requesting immediate backup. Hostile suspect refusing to comply. His words echoed through the street, sending a ripple of tension through the onlookers. Shaq didn't move. He didn't flinch. He had seen this game played before. The officer wasn't calling for help. He was calling for control. Within seconds, the distant wail of sirens grew louder, slicing through the quiet murmur of the cafe crowd. People shifted uneasily, some gripping their phones tighter, others exchanging worried glances. Two squad cars screeched to a halt in front of the cafe, red and blue lights flashing aggressively. The doors swung open, and uniformed officers stepped out, hands hovering over their holsters as they scanned the scene. Daniel smirked, arms crossed as he watched them approach. This was his moment. Backup had arrived, and soon this entire situation would be wrapped up exactly how he wanted. But then something he didn't expect happened. One of the responding officers, a tall man with graying temples, locked eyes with Shaq. His brows furrowed as recognition dawned. He nudged his partner, whispering under his breath, "Wait, that's Big Shaq." The second officer blinked, his hand falling away from his belt. "No way," he muttered. His eyes darted from the shattered side mirror to Shaq's towering frame, then to Daniel's, who was standing there like he had already won. Shaq exhaled slowly, reading their faces. He could tell. They knew something was off. But Daniels wasn't about to lose control of the situation. His grip tightened around his cuffs as he stepped forward, clearing his throat. "You're under arrest," he declared, voice firm, eyes locked on Shaq. A murmur rippled through the crowd. People gasped. The officers hesitated. Shaq, still standing completely still, arched an eyebrow. "For what?" Daniel smirked, tapping the cuffs against his palm. "Obstruction. Resisting an officer." Shaq let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Nah, you're reaching, bro." But Daniels wasn't backing down. His fingers twitched as he took another step forward. The crowd held its breath. The officers exchanged glances. And just like that, the situation was seconds away from spiraling completely out of control. Shaq let out a deep chuckle, shaking his head as he locked eyes with Daniels. "Nah, you ain't arresting me today." His voice was calm, but there was a weight behind it, a quiet warning that sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. Daniels clenched his jaw, his fingers twitching over his cuffs. "You're refusing to comply." He took a step forward, attempting to tower over Shaq. But even at his full height, he was nothing compared to the mountain of a man standing in front of him. Shaq didn't move. His stance remained relaxed, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. "Comply with what exactly? Owning my own car?" He gestured toward the shattered side mirror, the glass still glistening on the pavement. "Or is it just 'cause I don't look like the kind of guy you think should be driving it?" A murmur spread through the crowd. The cafe patrons who had been silently observing were now fully invested, their phones held high, recording every second. Daniel's face darkened. He yanked out his radio, voice sharp with frustration. "We have a non-compliant suspect, requesting immediate backup." One of the other officers hesitated before stepping forward, glancing between Shaq and Daniels. His expression wasn't just concern, it was doubt. "Sir, you sure about this?" Daniels turned on him in an instant, his eyes flashing with anger. "What? You scared of a celebrity?" Shaq scoffed, crossing his arms. "This ain't about celebrity, bro. This about right and wrong." The weight of his words settled over the scene. Another officer shifted uncomfortably, as if suddenly aware of how bad this looked. Daniels, however, wasn't listening. His pride had taken control, and he was too deep into his own power trip to stop now. His hand shot down to his belt, fingers curling around his baton. The crowd tensed. The air became electric with the possibility of what might happen next. Daniel's grip tightened, his knuckles going white. "We'll see about that." And in one swift motion, he yanked the baton free, raising it high above his head. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman in the cafe let out a startled yelp. Shaq remained completely still, his eyes locked onto Daniels with him, a look that was unreadable, but dangerously calm. The moment hung in the air, stretched thin like a wire ready to snap. And then, Daniels swung. Daniels' baton cut through the air with speed, but Shaq didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on the officer, body completely still, until the very last second. With reflexes honed from years of playing at the highest level, Shaq's massive hand shot up, catching the baton mid-swing. The force of the impact sent a dull thwack through the air, but Shaq barely moved an inch. For a brief moment, everything froze. The crowd let out a collective gasp. Someone muttered under their breath, "Oh, he done messed up now." A few phones zoomed in, capturing every detail of the standoff. Daniel's eyes widened as he struggled to yank the baton free, but it was like trying to pull a tree branch out of cement. Shaq didn't just hold it, he owned it. With the slightest twist of his wrist, he wrenched the baton clean out of Daniel's grip and held it up between them like a trophy. Daniel stumbled back, face burning red with humiliation. "That's assault on an officer," he barked, pointing a shaking finger at Shaq. Shaq raised an eyebrow, twirling the baton effortlessly in his fingers before letting it dangle at his side. "Nah," he said, voice low and even. "That's just me not letting you hit me." The officer's hands clenched into fists. He looked around, expecting the other officers to back him up, but they were frozen in place. One of them shifted uneasily, eyes flicking between the baton and Shaq's grip and the growing number of spectators. Daniels wasn't backing down. He reached for his radio again. "All units, we need—" But before he could finish, the sound of screeching tires tore through the tension like a gunshot. A black SUV came to a violent halt right at the curb, nearly jumping onto it in the process. The doors flew open, and a towering figure stepped out, his badge catching the sunlight as he stormed forward. Police Chief Hernandez. His eyes swept across the scene, the shattered side mirror, the baton in Shaq's hand, Daniel's flustered stance, and his expression hardened. The entire mood of the crowd shifted. Phones were already recording, but now people were whispering excitedly. Daniel's confidence flickered. "Sir, I was just—" Hernandez raised a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. His voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. "What the hell is going on here?" The black SUV came to a sharp stop, its tires screeching against the pavement, drawing the attention of the entire crowd. The tension in the air thickened as the doors swung open with force, and out stepped Police Chief Hernandez. He was a broad-shouldered man with an air of absolute authority, his dark blue uniform pressed to perfection, the gold insignia on his chest gleaming under the afternoon sun. His expression was unreadable, but the way his sharp eyes scanned the scene made it clear. He was assessing everything at once: the broken side mirror, the baton in Shaq's grip, the nervous energy of the surrounding officers, and most importantly, the man standing at the center of it all, Officer Daniels. The chief's jaw tightened as he took a step forward, his polished boots clicking against the pavement. "What the hell is going on here?" His voice was low and controlled, but it carried the weight of a man who expected answers. Immediately, the crowd instinctively hushed, their cameras still recording, waiting to see how this would unfold. Daniels, despite the sweat forming on his brow, attempted to maintain his composure. He straightened his stance, squared his shoulders, and forced an air of confidence into his voice. "Sir, I was handling—" Before he could finish, Hernandez cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. His tone remained steady, but the underlying anger was impossible to miss. "Handling what exactly?" He gestured toward the shattered side mirror, then to the baton that Shaq still held with effortless strength. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you weren't handling anything. You were escalating." Daniel's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the officers who had arrived as backup. None of them spoke in his defense. The chief's gaze bore into him, unrelenting. Smashing a civilian's car? Calling for backup on a man who did nothing wrong? Or were you about to slap cuffs on someone just because they don't fit the image you want them to? A murmur ran through the crowd, people shifting uncomfortably as they realized how deep the tension ran. Shaq, still calm but unmistakably watchful, crossed his arms over his broad chest. He hadn't said much since Hernandez arrived, but his presence alone spoke volumes. The chief exhaled sharply before turning to Shaq, his face momentarily softening. "Mr. O'Neill, I'm going to handle this personally. Daniels took a step forward, attempting to regain control of the situation. Sir, Hernandez didn't even let him finish. He raised a hand, palm outward, signaling him to stop. His voice dropped to a dangerous quiet, but the authority in it was unmistakable. Not another word. Daniel's mouth opened slightly as if to argue, but no words came. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, his face burning with frustration, but he knew better than to push back against the chief, not with this many eyes on them. The crowd remained silent, the tension holding them in place like an invisible force. They all knew this wasn't over yet. Hernandez took a slow, deliberate breath before shifting his stance, his gaze never leaving Daniels. What came next would decide more than just this moment. It would determine the fate of the officer standing before him. Daniels licked his dry lips, shifting his weight uneasily as the eyes of the crowd bore into him. He could feel the tension thick in the air, pressing down on his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. His mind raced for an excuse, anything that could get him out of this mess. Clearing his throat, he straightened his posture, forcing an air of confidence he no longer felt. Sir, I believe the car was stolen, he said, his voice cracking slightly. I had reason to suspect. Chief Hernandez arched an eyebrow, unimpressed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his fingers moving with practiced ease as he tapped the screen a few times. Then turning the device so everyone could see, he held up an official document. Oh yeah? Hernandez asked, voice dripping with skepticism. Then why does the vehicle registration have Mr. O'Neill's name on it? The crowd murmured, a few gasps slipping through. One bystander chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. Another whispered, Man, this dude just played himself. Daniel's face turned a deep shade of red, his jaw tightening as he struggled for a response. That must be fake, he stammered, his voice growing more desperate. People fake documents all the time. Shaq, who had remained mostly silent up until now, let out a low chuckle. It wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was the kind of laugh that carried a warning, the kind that let everyone know the situation had gone from ridiculous to downright pathetic. You really gonna die on that hill, bro? Shaq said, shaking his head as he crossed his massive arms over his chest. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. The other officers standing nearby shifted uncomfortably. Some exchanged uneasy glances, while others stared at the ground, clearly wanting nothing to do with the disaster unfolding in front of them. They knew. Everyone knew. Daniels was finished. The chief let out a long, tired sigh, rubbing the bridge of his nose before leveling Daniels with a stare that could cut through steel. All right, Daniels, he said, his voice firm. Turn in your badge. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Daniels' breath hitched, his fingers twitching at his side. His career, his authority, everything he had built, gone in an instant. The silence was deafening, but everyone knew this was only the beginning. Daniels opened his mouth, desperation flickering in his eyes. His mind scrambled for a last-ditch excuse, a way to twist the situation in his favor. But before he could utter a single word, a voice cut through the tension like a blade. Check the footage, someone in the crowd shouted. Every head turned toward the source of the voice, a man in his late 20s, holding up his phone. The screen was still recording, the red dot blinking in the corner. I got everything, he continued, his voice steady. The whole thing, from the second he smashed the mirror. A murmur rippled through the onlookers, a mix of anger and anticipation crackling in the air. More people pulled out their phones, replaying the incident on their screens. Daniel's face drained of color. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. For the first time that evening, he was speechless. Chief Hernandez's jaw tightened as he stepped forward, his gaze locked on the screen. The footage was damning. It clearly showed Daniels approaching the Rolls-Royce, gripping his baton, and, without hesitation, slamming it into the side mirror. The next few minutes played out exactly as the crowd had witnessed. Daniel's smirk, his baseless accusations, the way he reached for his cuffs despite Shaq never lifting a finger in aggression. The chief inhaled deeply, his expression darkening. You lied, he said, his voice eerily calm. You lied to me, to your fellow officers, and you tried to weaponize your badge to cover it up. Daniel shook his head quickly, his voice shaky. Chief, Save it, Hernandez snapped, his patience finally snapping. His gaze flickered to one of the officers standing nearby, a younger cop who had been watching in stunned silence. Take him in, Daniel's breath hitched. His eyes darted between the chief and the officers around him. Wait, you can't do this. I was just, you were just caught, Shaq cut in, his deep voice carrying over the murmurs. On camera, by a dozen people. He tilted his head. Ain't nowhere left to run, bro. A pair of cuffs, the same ones Daniels had intended to use on Shaq, were suddenly snapped around his own wrists. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause. Some whistled, others shook their heads in satisfaction. But as Daniels was led toward the squad car, his face twisted into something else. Not just fear, but something darker. Vengeance. And Shaq noticed. The sharp click of the handcuffs echoed through the night air like a final verdict. Officer Daniels stood frozen, his face contorted in disbelief as his own wrists were locked together. His mouth opened, then closed, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. You can't do this, he barked, his voice laced with desperation. I was doing my job. Chief Hernandez let out a slow, measured breath, shaking his head. His face held no sympathy, only disappointment. No, Daniels. Your job was to serve and protect. Instead, you let your ego and prejudice turn you into a disgrace to the badge. He motioned to the officers flanking Daniels. Get him out of here. The crowd, which had been simmering with tension moments ago, exploded into cheers. Applause and whistles rang out, and some bystanders clapped Shaq on the shoulder, as if he had just won a championship game. Shaq, however, wasn't smiling. His gaze remained locked on Daniels, watching the officer's expression shift from shock to simmering rage. This wasn't just about getting caught. This was personal. Daniel's eyes burned with unspoken resentment, the kind that didn't just fade away. You think this is over? Daniels hissed under his breath as the officers gripped his arms, guiding him toward the squad car. You just wait. Shaq didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, voice calm but firm. Yeah? I'll be waiting. Daniels was shoved into the back seat, and the door slammed shut behind him. The sight of a disgraced officer in cuffs, the very ones he had intended for Shaq, sent another wave of cheers through the crowd. People pulled out their phones, already posting the scene online. Social media was blowing up, the hashtag number Justice for Shaq already trending. As the squad car pulled away, the cameras quickly turned back to the man at the center of it all. A reporter pushed forward, microphone extended. Shaq, do you have a statement? Shaq glanced at the flashing cameras, then back at the sea of people watching him. He took a deep breath, rolling his shoulders back. He wasn't about to waste this moment. Yeah, he said, voice steady. I got a few things to say. The camera zoomed in, the crowd leaning closer. And just like that, the world was listening. Shaq adjusted his jacket, his broad shoulders squaring as he turned to face the crowd of reporters and flashing cameras. The energy in the air was electric. People held up their phones, capturing every second, knowing that whatever he was about to say would spread across the internet like wildfire. The moment was his. He smirked, tilting his head slightly. Yeah, I got a statement. The noise of the crowd died down instantly. The microphone was shoved closer to him, and every camera lens zoomed in, waiting for his words. Shaq let the tension build, then spoke, his voice deep and unwavering. Justice ain't just for the rich. It's for everyone. The weight of his words sent a ripple through the onlookers. There was no anger in his tone, no theatrics, just the simple, undeniable truth. The crowd erupted in cheers, applause echoing against the buildings. Social media feeds flooded with live recordings, and within seconds, the hashtag number, Justice for Shaq, skyrocketed in trending lists. From across the street, a teenage boy watching on his phone gasped. Yo, it already hit 1 million views. Reporters fired off questions. Shaq, do you think this incident will change anything? Will you press charges against Daniels? How do you feel about what happened tonight? Shaq took a breath, his eyes scanning the faces in front of him. I feel like this ain't just about me. It's about how many times this happens when cameras aren't rolling. If tonight proves anything, it's that people in power get away with too much. Until somebody stands up. A wave of murmurs spread through the crowd. He wasn't just talking about himself. He was talking about something bigger. At that moment, Chief Hernandez stepped forward. The authority in his posture was undeniable, but there was something else there too. Regret. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples before finally meeting Shaq's gaze. Shaq. The chief hesitated, then sighed. I owe you an apology. The crowd went silent again. Even the reporters seemed caught off guard. Shaq didn't move, didn't blink. He just stared at the chief, waiting. The air was thick with anticipation. And then, just like that, the power shifted. The fallout from the incident was swift and unforgiving. By morning, the official police statement confirmed what the world had already seen unfold in real time. Officer Daniels was terminated from his position and formally charged with misconduct. The department, now under intense public scrutiny, had no choice but to act. News headlines plastered his face across television screens. Corrupt cop exposed after targeting Shaq. The city's mayor held a press conference, flanked by Chief Hernandez, addressing the growing unrest. Effective immediately, we are launching a full-scale review of our law enforcement policies. We cannot allow officers like Daniels to continue tarnishing the badge. It was damage control at its finest. But the public wanted more than words. They wanted action. And Shaq? He wasted no time making sure real change followed. In a single tweet that sent shockwaves through social media, Shaq announced a personal donation of $100,000 to fund police training programs focused on de-escalation and racial bias. His caption read, "Change doesn't come from talk. It comes from action. Let's fix the system. Not just for me, but for everyone." The response was immediate. Celebrities, activists, and everyday citizens flooded the comments, praising his efforts. Donations from the public poured in, and within hours, Shaq's initiative had raised over $1 million in additional funding. Meanwhile, Daniels, now disgraced and out of a job, had vanished from the public eye. But just when the dust seemed to be settling, a new video surfaced, and it changed everything. The grainy footage, uploaded by an anonymous source, showed Daniels in a different encounter, months before the incident with Shaq. In the clip, he shoved a young black man against a wall during a routine traffic stop, laughing as he taunted him. "You think someone's coming to save you? Ain't no cameras here, boy." But now there were cameras everywhere. The clip exploded online. The world wasn't just angry anymore. They were furious. A reporter raced toward Shaq outside a charity event. "Shaq, have you seen the new footage of Daniels?" Shaq paused, narrowing his eyes. "Nah, but I had a feeling there was more to this story." As Shaq approached his newly repaired Rolls-Royce, the glossy black paint reflecting the city lights, he took a deep breath. The chaos of the past few days was finally behind him. Daniels had been fired, justice had been served, and real changes were on the horizon. But as he reached for the car door, a small voice called out behind him, "Shaq!" He turned to see a young boy, no older than 10, clutching a basketball in one hand and tugging at his mother's sleeve with the other. His eyes were wide with excitement, his sneakers scuffing against the pavement as he hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. "You a superhero?" the kid asked, tilting his head up to meet Shaq's towering gaze. Shaq chuckled, crouching down so they were at eye level. "Nah, lil' man," he said with a warm grin. "Just a guy who stands up for what's right." The boy beamed, gripping his ball tighter. "But you stopped the bad guy. And you didn't even need superpowers." Shaq smiled, reaching out to ruffle the boy's hair. "You don't need powers to do the right thing. Just gotta have the heart to stand up when it counts." The kid nodded enthusiastically, turning to his mother. "See, Mom? I told you Shaq's the real deal." His mother smiled, giving Shaq an appreciative nod. "Thank you for what you did," she said. "For standing up, for showing people that things can change." Shaq nodded, his expression turning serious for just a moment. "It ain't about me. It's about all of us making sure we don't let things like that slide. If you see something wrong, you call it out. That's how change happens." As he stood back up, the mother and son waved goodbye, disappearing into the growing crowd of onlookers. Shaq opened his car door, sliding into the driver's seat. He exhaled, glancing at his phone buzzing on the dashboard. 50 million views. The video of the incident had spread across every platform, dominating the news cycle, sparking national conversations about police reform, accountability, and racial profiling. People weren't just talking about what had happened to Shaq. They were talking about what needed to change moving forward. And for Shaq, that was the real victory. His phone buzzed again. Another notification, another story, another injustice somewhere else. He smirked, gripping the wheel. Time to clean house again.